It's my pleasure to introduce this book, Wild Women, Seekers, Protagonists and Goddesses in Sacred Indian Poetry, and to welcome Arundhathi to Bangalore and BIC.
Thank you.
There is a temple that I go to, a Dakshinamurti temple, which is encircled by murtis of a number of gurus. Matsyendranath, Gorakhnath, Jalandharnath, Kanifanath, Charapatinath, Naganath, Bhattarinath, Revananath, Gahaninath, all male. There's a problem here. Although the first guru of each one of us is our mother, although there are numerous seekers and adepts among women, although there are so many goddesses in India, one for every village, why do the majority of seers and seekers seem to be men, more visible, more articulate? And this is what is resolved by this anthology. Wild Women is a rebalancing act. Steadily, methodically, Arundhathi Subramaniam plumbs the time and space of the Indian region to shine a new light on women, seekers, protagonists, and goddesses. She opens the curtains to the less known and vibrant areas, the women power of our history. Reading this anthology, I felt like I was being introduced to a new heritage, a new sampradaya. Lakshminkara, who composed Advaya Siddha, Toral, Linal, Loyan of Saurashtra, yoginis from Odisha, Jiradaye, who authored Jhamaka Gita, Madhavi Dasi, Taj Bibi, who adored Krishna, Padma Priya, the first Assamese poet, and Shenkottai Andai Akkal, my new best friend. At the same time, it's not just women as gender, it's women as a role. And we find out how male poet seekers adopt the female voice, the condition of femininity. And vulnerability is not the opposite of power. And divisions are blurred. To quote Uddhava Das, who can tell who is the man, who is the woman in this ecstasy? The second feature of this book is its collective effort, collective enterprise, and generosity. It takes the limelight of posterity and paints it more generously. Not just remembering Mirabai, Andal, Akka Mahadevi, Lalred, but calling in Indra Devi, Kanhopatra, Molla. The scale of this book is vast. It is an enterprise of translation and translators. Arundhathi has put a whole army of poets to work here. A multitude of women voices from history and legend speaking through a multitude of poetic voices today. The force of the past and the present stand as one here towards a more balanced future. Wild Women will prove to be a significant reference book. This book is ambitious, and it is an ambition realized. I'm delighted to be in conversation with the person, seeker, and protagonist, Arundhathi Subramaniam, who created this anthology. We'll open with a few leading questions so that we can sort of get the overview of the book. Please tell us the genesis of the book, of the concept, what triggered it, what started it, why did you do it? I know that your last book was Women Who Wear Only Themselves, and that also seems to have a women theme. How is this your particular interest? Can you tell us? Yeah.
First, thank you, Mani. I'm particularly glad that we are having this conversation. It's not always that one has a conversation with someone who has a journey of their own, and particularly an articulated spiritual journey. So I'm very glad that we're having this dialogue. And thank you all, those of you who are here on a rainy evening in Bangalore with innumerable demands on your time, I have no doubt. Thank you very much for choosing to be here. I think this particular book, it started, Mani, to answer your question, it started ostensibly 5 years ago. But if I were to be completely honest, it's probably been almost a lifetime in the making. And there are many ways in which one could start this question of, or try to explore this question of beginnings. I'd say, as a woman and a poet and a lover of poetry, every time I read sacred literature, I was always struck by the fact that the women I encountered were bloodless, frequently bodiless, ethereal sprites. They just seemed to have turned into little puffs of vapor. And I yearned, I think, as a woman myself, and I think many of us have felt this as modern creative practitioners as well, one yearned to hear about embodied women. Women who had hungers, women who had hormones, women who had appetites for life and for a deeper life. So I think that was one possible starting point. And this struck me years ago when I was in my adolescence, a very omnivorous reader of spiritual literature. I chafed because I just didn't find these voices. And later I found, of course, there are a few celebrated voices, all the ones that she mentioned. There's Mirabai, whom we've all heard of. There's Andal. There is Akka Mahadevi. Some of us have heard of Laldev. But all of them, it seemed to me, and particularly Mirabai, from the way I remember her in an Amar Chitra Katha, she seemed to have turned into this white, demure, unreal figure, kind of calendar art. She had been flattened into the state of sanctified specimenhood that I found very uncomfortable. And she seemed to look beatifically heavenward all the time. And it just felt like, surely there is another Mirabai, or who is she anyway? And the same with Andal, who is much deified in the south. So who were the women behind these flattened portraits of, this plaster sainthood? That was one question. And the other is, I think more recently, the fact that I'm deeply grateful to all the male mystics and poets that I've read down the ages. I'm very deeply grateful to them. The gurus too. From St. John of the Cross to Hafiz, from Tukaram to Nammalvar, and so many more. So this is not intending to set up some kind of opposition where none need exist. But what did strike me is the fact that while I'm deeply grateful for this heritage, where is the other half of the story? And I think this is a thirst that many of us feel without often acknowledging it. I think there's a very deep thirst in all of us for a less lopsided, more inclusive legacy of culture and spirituality.
Legacy is absolutely, I think, a spot-on word for this, because even as I was reading it, I was getting that sense of like a new legacy having been constructed, a matrilineal, a whole history, right from, of course, the book opens with Vak, and then you have the Buddhist nuns, the Therigatha, and right from the early centuries of the first millennium through the 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, we see a whole historical sort of progression of voices, and it seems as if they were always there. Of course they were there. But how come they're not actually so much in our consciousness, when the time that you're talking about, let us say 20 years ago, I too was reading those same books, Autobiography of a Yogi, and of course the Ramakrishna's Gospel. And of course in Ramakrishna's Gospel he's always warning people about women and gold. He's always warning people about women and gold. So it was always the male yearning for the spirit or for an inner life, and the woman was always the problem. Whereas when you take that and turn it around and say, but what about women? Of course they have an inner life. And where are all the expressions of that, So that, I think, is a very interesting question, and Arundhathi has actually pulled it out of the woodwork, pulled it out of history.
I think, Mani, it was very important for me when putting this anthology together. It was very important for me to have women of very different temperaments and backgrounds. So I started with what I thought was an elegantly curated list of about 20-odd women poets. I said maybe 25. And then they kept tumbling out of the woodwork as I started searching for them. And I discovered so many more. And to return to exactly what you said, the very Ramakrishna who speaks of Kamini Kanchan is also the Ramakrishna who directs us to the goddess, is also the Ramakrishna who has Bhairavi Brahmani as his guru, so as one of his teachers. So this is I think it's just a parallel stream, subterranean, that was just waiting to be acknowledged, really, more than anything else. So one of the things I knew as I started putting this together is that I wanted, for one, women of very different backgrounds. So there are the Buddhist nuns, there are Vedantins like Shengote Avudeyakal, there are tons of bhaktas, there are Sufis, there are Tantrikas like Jiradei and Lakshminkara, and I wanted all of them. I also wanted women of very different orientations, some more cerebral, some more devotional, some more meditative, contemplative, others more ecstatic. And I wanted women who had made very different life choices. This was important to me too. And I think this comes from, you mentioned Women Who Wear Only Themselves, my previous book. And one of the reasons for giving it that title was the fact that these were women who have exercised very different choices as far as their spirituality is concerned, but the sartorial metaphor was important in that book. So one woman in that book wears a monk's apparel, the other chooses to peel off all her clothes, and a third chooses to give up ochre and wear blue jeans. I wanted to honor each of those choices. And in this book, it isn't very different. There are the nuns, the Buddhist nuns, who presumably wore their ochre. There are householders, many women in the Vachana tradition, as we know in Karnataka, who walked alongside men who were their spiritual companions. The most exciting for me are the women poets of Saurashtra, the Gujarati women poets, because not only do they have male partners who are also their spiritual companions, they're also sometimes their devotees. So there's this lovely woman, Toral. Toral has a very happy marriage. Then Toral is abducted by a dacoit from Kutch, and Toral remains poised. A storm breaks out. The dacoit is terrified. Jaisal is terrified. Toral remains poised. And Jaisal finally falls at her feet and says, "Who are you?" And that's how his spiritual journey begins. So while many of these women acknowledge male gurus, they are also transformers in their own right.
And in that particular poem, when Toral is advising Jaisal, she's advising Jaisal about the spirit, about how to progress. So it's like the role of a teacher,
Very much so.
Very interesting. And how many women's voices are here, you think? Like 50, 100?
There are 56 women.
56 women. And I started with thinking, do I know 5 or 6 women's voices whom I can really like think of. I mean, if I thought more, I could pull out maybe another 5, maybe another 5. But 50 was a shock to me. I mean, to go through this anthology, I discovered a lot of voices. Some of them, Arundhati, very interestingly, the format struck me. Of course, like for example, Basava, we all know Basava. But here we have his 2 wives and we have his sister, who are also seekers in their own right. And their expressions and their poetry is really fascinating. And, it's like the limelight has always been on Basava, but what about these other voices that belong to women, right? Similarly, you have a servant in Namdev's household who is a woman servant, and she is a poet and seeker. It's fascinating how you have women from the shadows of the men.
In fact, that's exactly it. It just felt like these women have far too long been cameos. It felt like it was time to invite them center stage. Far too often, I think there are 2 kinds of problems here. One is that religious narratives often tend to sanitize, whitewash, and give us antiseptic women, unreal women. That's one problem. And the other is that there are rationalist narratives that sideline them entirely and don't consider them important at all. So somewhere between the 2, it feels like there is a vast sisterhood waiting to be recovered. And this, for me, was really about recovering ancestry. It was about recovering a powerful ancestry. Women who are not just obsequious followers, women who are not just groveling devotees, but strong, powerful women on their own journeys of discovery and self-reclamation. To me, that was important.
Yeah. And not only the figures, but also the traditions. Like you have from the Alvars, you have then from the Nayanmars, you have Karaikal Ammayar, then you have the Sharana tradition, you have the Charyapada. Each of these groupings that we all recognize as congregations of like voices in history, like little flashpoints in history where people have articulated themselves. There were women in those points, absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, I wondered at one point if I should how to organize this book. Okay. Should it have been organized, I wondered, on the basis of chronology, or should it be theological, sectarian, regional, linguistic? I toyed with all of that. And yes, there is a chronological organization, but essentially it is for me...
in the first part, though,
in the first section of the book. But essentially it is for me really about just naming women. I wanted them to be named. And in the act of naming, I believe we are honoring them with the simple act of attention and dignity, according them the dignity that they deserve. This, I think, is a deep pain that many carry around. It's a deep pain in many of us. The sense of just wanting the attention, the simple act of attentiveness for a little moment in time. And that's what the naming strategy was about, essentially.
And speaking of organization, the book is in 3 parts. And seekers, protagonists, and goddesses. So the first part has got women seekers. The second part has got protagonists, and you please do, elaborate on that for us. It's got male voices who assume the role of women in their expressions. And the third section is goddesses. Could you maybe just expand on these 3 sections a little bit? So what are the contents and what is the impetus in them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I knew initially it was to be a book of women mystic poets. That's how I thought of it. But almost as soon as I said wild women, as soon as I said it to myself, and the title suggested itself very early, almost immediately it felt like we needed the woman as seeker and the woman as sought. So the goddesses entered. And how can one not include those male poets who have given us some of the most memorable female protagonists? How can one not include them? I mean, when I read a Kabir or I read Shah Abdul Latif, And they have these women who stand tall and stand center stage, women willing to walk out into the dead of night, into a journey where success means no return, women who are willing to throw respectability and decorum to the winds.
You mean like
in their quest for freedom?
Like Radha or
well, Radha
or
too.
themselves, yeah.
Radha too. No, the women that they channel, the women protagonists. Okay. So it felt like these protagonists had to be there. And then, as I read further, I was amazed at what happened to the male poet's voice when he assumed the female persona, when he actually spoke as the woman, not merely of the woman, but as the woman. And frequently, in certain cases, especially when you see Annamacharya, for instance, the 15th century Telugu poet, when Annamacharya speaks to his god, it's a male god, it's Venkatesha of Tirupati, but when he speaks to his male god as a male seeker, the tone is imploring, it's beseeching. But when he speaks as a female seeker, it is a very different kind of voice. This is not just any seeker. This is a goddess in her own right. And she's a feisty, opinionated, temperamental goddess who knows she is as desired by this god as she desires him. So this, to me, is what the male poets often bring into the poetry.
So the template of Eros
here,
comes in through gender
in this
switching.
particular, in Annamacharya's poetry, and you find it, of course, in some of the others too. You find it in Vidyapati, Chandidas. It is the male poet channeling the female voice, and there is suddenly an erotic charge to the poetry. There is a much more egalitarian relationship with the divine in the poetry. Something changes. And that interested me.
And what about when there is a feminine divine? When the male poet's addressing the feminine divine?
Yes, so that's the entire third section. And, you know, that was a section in which I made such discoveries personally. And, you know, there is a belief that it's largely the male poet and the female divine. And it is true, there is a wonderful heritage of male poets who speak to their goddesses, and often as the mother. Mostly as the mother, but a very intimate mother. So when it comes to the Bengali poets of the 18th and 19th centuries, it's an intimate, almost backslapping relationship, which is possible with a mother. Intimacy is the cornerstone of it. But at the same time, I didn't want just the male poets in there. So that section has, on the one hand, it has devotees speaking to the goddess. There is the Chanda Maharoshana Tantra, which has the goddess speaking herself, so the goddess has a voice. There is the goddess as mother. There is also the goddess as lover, Alamelu Manga in Annamacharya. And there is...
That's a dramatic monologue kind of
It
thing,
is,
yeah.
where he actually channels the voice. And there is the, you know, there is the poetry of adoration, but there is also the poetry of argument, which I love. The fact that you can have an argumentative relationship with the divine, not just an erotic one, but an argumentative one. You can quarrel with this goddess and with this god.
Could you share an example, maybe?
Yes, in fact, I should have shared examples long ago. I'm sorry, I should have been reading poems. Okay. I feel it feels wrong to go right to the last section. Should I not be reading some of the earlier ones?
Doesn't matter. Let's have the argument first.
Okay. Let me read you my favorite, which is, well, there'll be arguments with the women too, but we're going to start with the male poet, unfortunately. We'll come back to the women. There are plenty of women. Maybe the man I should read you is in fact the one I spoke of, Annamacharya. Annamacharya's heroine, Alamelu Manga, is this flirtatious goddess who, of course, is in love with Venkatesha, who, like all gods, cannot have a monogamous relationship. Gods cannot. You know, they're busy doing other things. So she has her own equation with him. So when he comes and he, you know, he's clearly trying to woo her, she says, unless I want it myself, it doesn't count as love. So this is an extraordinary statement of mutuality coming from a 15th century poet, only when he is able to channel the female voice. So here's Alamelu Manga in a poem that I love to read. She tells you, and this is a poem that works perfectly as a romantic poem, as most of you will recognize. It works perfectly as a romantic poem and perfectly as a mystical poem, where she says time and again, he's the boss. And you know what she really means. He's the master. What can I say when he says I'm better than the others? I don't even have to ask. He takes whatever I say as a command. Why should I brag? My husband is under my thumb. He's the master. Who am I to serve him when he takes joy in serving me? How can I tell you the 1,000 ways he's with me? He knows everything, just like God. And he praises me. He's the master. I'm always in his arms. He's always laughing with me. He's the God on the hill. And I'm Alamelu Manga. Do I have to make a statement? He's my slave. He's the master. What on earth is she saying? And of course we know it. This is the language of poetry. We recognize it, and we don't even need to understand it. We recognize it immediately, that both these are, of course, perfectly true. He's the master. He's my slave. I think that's what...
Who translated that one?
That's David Shulman and V. Narayana Rao. I think that's what the male poets bring, I think we realize as we are drawn to this rising ardor of the bedchamber, where the sexual union is a metaphor, of course, for the spiritual union, as we are drawn there as the listener, we are being invited to a place of such betweenness that all identities collapse, all hierarchies collapse. We don't know where the man ends and the woman begins. We don't know where the divine ends and the human begins. We don't know where God ends and the bhakta begins. And we don't know who's superior and who's inferior.
You know, one difference I found among the women voices and the men's voices was that women talk about, release me from these shackles. Please get rid of my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, my husband, so then it's just you and me. They talk about, that's a format, and that's absolutely an ask. Whereas the men don't seem to do that.
Well, presumably because that was not a shackle for them, right? It has never been. I think that's self-evident, the reasons why it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But I will also say that what excites me about the women is, yes, they talk about kill my mother-in-law, as perhaps one should sometimes, but they also say other things. They also talk, this interests me, Amani, they talk about their own journeys of freedom. And to me, there are so many moments of freedom that are not predicated on mothers-in-law or men in the women poets. So for instance, you have someone like Dayabai, the 18th century Hindi poet, who says, I became an acrobat girl and I caper across the vaults of the sky. This is a transcendent moment. This is not predicated on anyone else. And it's moments like that. It's Patachara, the Buddhist nun, 2,500 years ago. This is a voice that sounds like it was today. Patachara just talks of going into her cell. It's just one day like any other. She washes her feet and she watches the water flow. High to low. She just watches the flow of water, goes into her cell, pulls up the candle wick. It is such a small, inconsequential detail. She says, I just pulled up the wick of my lamp, and I was realized. So it is a thunderclap moment, but with such a wealth of quotidian detail behind it.
Actually, that is a very interesting particular, because the meaning of nirvana is blowing out, and it is the pulling of...
She pulls it up.
Yeah, takes out the wick. That's
To me,
fascinating.
this
how
is
that trope
exciting, yes. But it's also interesting to me that these happen not as big moments. They're not celebrated. This is not the Buddha's celebrated nirvana. It is an ordinary nirvana.
And not only are they, of course, there is the whole play, the humor about, the mother-in-law humor that I talked about. But also there is real wisdom in what they're talking about. You have Shenkotai who talks about, is it Ekil or Etchil? Etchil. She talks about Juta, right? Yengili in Telugu. She talks about how there is no such thing. The egalitarianism, the sort of the dismissal of hypocrisy and of orthodoxy.
I think also the orthodoxy and the body.
And the body.
The body. In some way, the body cannot be ignored. And I think the women poets bring it to us up front and center. Whether it is someone like Amrapali, the beautiful courtesan 2,500 years ago, whom we've all seen as Vaijayanti Mala, of course. But this is not the beautiful Vaijayanti Mala stroke Amrapali. This is an aging Amrapali, looking down at her body. This is the body that is decaying. And I believe, and I hope some of you will pick up the book and read the poem for yourself, in that particular poem, she looks down at the body and there is regret and sadness, but there's also wonder. Wonder at the beauty of this, that this body once was, at the possibility that it once was. So yes, there is
strong integration between the body and the spirit.
And I'd say this is
awareness of the body is the instrument for it.
The instrument, and in the process, the orthodoxies are questioned. So whether it's the Dalit woman poet Mirabai who says, if menstrual blood makes me impure, tell me who wasn't born of that blood. Whether it's Shengote Avude Akal who takes the very trope of menstruation and celebrates it. These are women who don't let us escape the body, but in fact, I think, remind us that they're not just interested, and this, I have to read you a poem. They're not just interested in passively worshipping the divine. They're interested in embodying the divine. To me, this is what, say, for instance, a poet whom I had never heard of until I discovered her, by happenstance. It was a wonderful moment of discovery. This is the 17th century Kashmiri poet, Rupa Bhavani. And we have some of the translators in the audience, and I'm going to ask them very soon to come up and read more poems. But before that, allow me to read Rupa Bhavani to you, if I can find her. I love her, really. She's, for me, the discovery, one of the big discoveries of this book. Okay, I think I have us in a photocopy. Rupa Bhavani says in this poem, I have not bowed, I never will. The one who listens stands resplendent within me. That is worship. That is what I do. I have not bowed, I never will. The one who listens stands resplendent within me. That is worship. That is what I do. These are not women who are interested in becoming custodians of God. They're not interested in the wisdom of the priests and the pandits and the cultural sentinels and the religious gatekeepers of the world. They're not interested in being custodians because they want to become conduits of the divine.
This is fascinating. So the men actually take on women's voices. When we talk about how they take on the feminine condition, we're not talking about servility and subservience. We're actually talking about becoming more empowered and becoming more able to have a relationship with the divine. So that's the unexpected turn, I think, in that. Yeah. Shall we move to translations, you think?
We can move to translations, but not without my reading you, Janabai. I have to read the woman who inspired the title of this particular session. Janabai was a 13th century maidservant in the home of Namdev, a celebrated poet. And hers is one of the most interesting and the most courageous voices that I've encountered. And her relationship with Namdev is her guru. She has a certain respect, deep respect for Namdev. But when it comes to Vitthala, her god, the relationship is one of backslapping familiarity. So when she's tired, Vitthala will do the dishes for her. When she's even more exhausted, Vitthala will wash her hair. When he's tired, sometimes Janabai will cook a meal for him, and he belches his love all over her. So it's a very endearing relationship with the divine. And so Janabai is able to say, with the kind of jauntiness that only Janabai can say it with, especially when she is translated by Arun Kolatkar, I eat God, I drink God, I sleep on God, I buy God, I count God, I deal with God. God is here, God is there, void is not devoid of God. God is within, God is without, and what's more, there's God to spare. It seems like, thank you, it feels like the right moment to invite on stage Vanamala Vishwanatha, who's translated Akka Mahadevi, and of course to be reading Akka Mahadevi here in Karnataka feels deeply right. Vanamala.
Both the speakers were talking about the body and embodiment as the mode through which spirituality, finds its expression. And Akka is all body, and but it is the woman's spirit in that body that she, that voices whatever she's saying. And I won't explain too much because the poems say who she is. So just look at this. There's some nakra also here, which is what I love. Hear me if you will, spurn me if you want. I cannot but sing your praises, Ayya. See me if you will, shun me if you won't. I cannot but delight in you, Ayya. Cherish me if you will, detest me if you won't. I cannot but embrace you, Ayya. Love me if you will, loathe me if you won't. I cannot but adore you, Ayya. Chenamallikarjunayya, applauding you, celebrating you, I shall dance in ecstasy, Ayya. Right? So, what a celebration of the moment, right? And her vulnerability they were talking about. What power in this vulnerability to own up, what she feels. And I thought maybe I could, read it in Kannada also for you. In a way, it's a suicidal act to juxtapose one's translation against the original. But Akka deserves. So, Ayya, ನೀ ಕೇಳಿದರೆ ಕೇಳು, ಕೇಳದಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾಡು. ನಾನಿನ್ನ ಹಾಡಿದಲ್ಲದೆ ಸೈರಿಸಲಾರೆನಯ್ಯ. ಅಯ್ಯ, ನೀನು ಒಲಿದರೆ ಒಲಿ, ಒಲಿಯದಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾಡು. ನಾನಿನ್ನ ಪೂಜಿಸಿದಲ್ಲದೆ ಸೈರಿಸಲಾರೆನಯ್ಯ. ಅಯ್ಯ, ನೀ ಮೆಚ್ಚಿದರೆ ಮೆಚ್ಚು, ಮೆಚ್ಚದಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾಡು. ನಾ ನಿನ್ನ ನಪ್ಪಿದಲ್ಲದೆ ಸೈರಿಸಲಾರೆನಯ್ಯ. ಅಯ್ಯ, ನೀ ನೋಡಿದರೆ ನೋಡು, ನೋಡದಿದ್ದರೆ ಮಾಡು. ನಾನಿನ್ನ ನೋಡಿ ಹೀಗೆ ಹಾರೈಸಿದಲ್ಲದೆ ಸೈರಿಸಲಾರೆನಯ್ಯ. ಚೆನ್ನಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನಯ್ಯ, ನಾ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಪೂಜಿಸಿ ಹರ್ಷದಲ್ಲಿ ಓಲಾಡುವೆನಯ್ಯ. Right? That is one. And there's another one about which we had a fight. So I'll read that. That is the Arundhathi and I. We had a fight? Yeah. So, yeah.
I was clearly deep in meditation. I don't remember this at all.
Yes. So, this is the poem. See, Kannada has this twin Dvirukti it's called. Sarasarna Nadadaru, Galagalane Attaru, etc. So it's a very powerful way of putting things, So I'll read this poem to you. You tell me, have I done it right, or would it have been done, should it have been done differently, or could it have been done differently?
I'm not sure that's a fair question, but do.
Yeah. Melting like moist soil, slipping like dry sand, pining in my dream, I turn distraught. Whirling like kiln fire, I seethed, not a friend in sight. Chanamallikarjuna, grant me a body that cannot be seen by seeking, a bliss that cannot be had by coupling. So, see here in Kannada, ಎರೆಯಂತೆ ಕರಕರಗಿ ಮಳಲಂತೆ ಜರಿಜರಿದು ಕನಸಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಳವಳಿಸಿ ಆನು ಬೆರಗಾದೆ ಆವಗೆಯ ಕಿಚ್ಚಿನಂತೆ ಸುಳಿಸುಳಿದು ಬೆಂದೆ ಆಪತ್ತಿಗೆ ಸಖಿಯನು ನಾನಾರುವನು ಕಾಣೆ ಅರಸಿ ಕಾಣದ ತನುವ ಬೆರಸಿ ಕೂಡದ ಸುಖವ ಎನಗೆ ನೀ ಕರುಣಿಸು ಚನ್ನಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನ. ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಎರೆಯಂತೆ ಕರಕರಗಿ ಮಳಲಂತೆ ಜರಿಜರಿದು, it enacts the process. So I would like to translate it as melting, melting like moist soil, slipping, slipping like dry sand, pining in my dream, I turn distraught, whirling, whirling like kiln fire. More effective, I would have thought, but English doesn't allow this as a very felicitous way of putting things. So I said, okay, boss. So, time for one more?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. Even in Kannada, this is unusual because none of the male poets, I don't think, they have used this kind of a language or style to say what they want to say. Look at that sense of urgency with which she says this. Hunger, wait a minute. Thirst, wait a minute. Sleep, wait a minute. Lust, wait a minute. Anger, wait a minute. Passion, wait a minute. Greed, wait a moment. Arrogance, wait a moment. Envy, wait a moment. Every moving and non-moving thing, I beseech you, wait a moment. I am your supplicant, carrying an urgent missive from my Lord Channamallikarjuna. So, put everything on hold. Put everything on hold. So, this is in Kannada. 78. ಹಸಿವೆ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ತೃಷೆಯೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ನಿದ್ರೆಯೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ಕಾಮವೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ಕ್ರೋಧವೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ಮೋಹವೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ಲೋಭವೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ಮದವೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ಮಚ್ಚರವೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ಸಚರಾಚರವೇ ನೀನು ನಿಲ್ಲು ನಿಲ್ಲು, ನಾ ಚೆನ್ನಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನ ದೇವರ ಅವಸರದ ಓಲೆಯನ್ನು ಯುತ್ತಲಿದ್ದೇನೆ ಶರಣಾರ್ಥಿ. That is Akka for you.
Lovely. Thank you, Vanamala. Maybe at the end, if there's more time, we'll have some more. But that was beautifully read. Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. And I'd like to invite Ahalya Balal to read some of the other poets in the Vachana tradition that she's translated. And I don't remember a fight, but I do remember I must say, the reason this book took 5 years is because I just enjoyed the email exchanges I was having with some of the translators. I do remember a very long email exchange. And that was one of the reasons that this book became pleasurable.
Because I said fight, everybody woke up.
We need the argumentative wild women.
Yeah, thank you, Arundhathi. After Akka, the other Vachanakartis who are not as well known as Akka, I remember a poem by Arundhathi in another earlier collection where she speaks of, I speak for girls with orange lunch boxes, something like that, yeah? The ones who play tree number 3 in an orchard of 8 in the school annual play. So I was very much reminded of that when she asked me whether I would like to translate. So I just want to read out Akka Mahadevi. A brief background in Arundhathi's words. The poetic utterances of 33 women associated with the spiritual efflorescence of the Sharana movement in 12th century Karnataka have endured. Many of these women poets were married to men who were their spiritual partners as well as poets in their own right. Akka Mahadevi and her husband Mahadeva renounced a life of privilege in Kashmir to migrate south to Kalyana in Karnataka. This was the locus of the great spiritual community established by the poet reformer and visionary Basavanna. Mani Rao referred to Basavanna earlier. Yeah. The Sharana movement fostered by him was a vibrant initiative that offered sanctuary to many. It boasted of the famous Anubhava Mantapa, experience pavilion, a crucible for mystics, philosophers, spiritual seekers, and poets. The focus here was on inner experience rather than doctrine or ritual, and on subjective insight rather than dogma. Akka Mahadevi. ಆವ ಬೀಜವ ಬಿತ್ತಿದಳು ಪೃಥ್ವಿಗೆ ಬೇರು ಬಯಲಿಂಗೆ ಶಾಖೆ ತಲೆದೋರಿ ಬೆಳೆವಂತೆ ಐಕ್ಯಕ್ಕೆ ಮರೆ ಕ್ರಿಗೆ ಬಾಹ್ಯ ಉಭಯದ ಭೇದವುಳ್ಳನ್ನಕ್ಕ ಭಕ್ತಿಯ ಹೋರಾಟ ಬಿಡದು ಎನ್ನಯ್ಯ ಪ್ರಿಯ ಇಮ್ಮಡಿ ನಿಕ್ಕಳಂಕ ಮಲ್ಲಿಕಾರ್ಜುನ ಮಣಿಯುಳ್ಳನ್ನಕ್ಕ ಪವಣಿಕೆಯ ಹಂಗು ಬಿಡದು. Whatever the seed sown, roots grow into the earth, branches head out into the sky. Union is within, action is without. As long as duality exists, there's struggle in devotion. O beloved of my Lord, the twice pristine Mallikarjuna, as long as beads exist, the act of stringing is inevitable. Then there's Lingamma. I'm quite ashamed. I've done an MA in Kannada. I work in the field of advertising. I do translations in Kannada. I've never heard of Lingamma so far until Arundhathi pointed out. Yeah? So Lingamma's work suggests a woman of no mean spiritual accomplishment. In one poem, she asks rhetorically, for one who has transcended the body, is there any more to learn? In another, she says, the devotee who has overcome the three, seeing, seer, and sight, has ascended the three summits. The crisp precision of her words seemed to emerge from a wealth of subjective experience, suggesting that Lingamma knew whereof she spoke. Her language is marked by unadorned clarity and profundity and is described by scholar-translator H.S. Shivaprakash as cryptic but haunting. Lingamma. Ayya, ಕಿಚ್ಚಿನೊಳಗೆ ಬೆಂದ ಕಾಯಕ್ಕೆ ಅಚ್ಚುಗ ಉಂಟೆ ತಾನು ತಾನಾದ ಬಳಿಕ ಮಾನವರ ಹಂಗುಂಟೆ ಮನವು ಮಹದಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಂದ ಬಳಿಕ ಮರವೆಯುಂಟೆ ತನುವ ಮರೆದಂಗೆ ಇನ್ನರಿಯಬೇಕೆಂಬ ಅರುಹುಂಟೆ ಬೆಳಗ ಕಂಡವಂಗೆ ಕತ್ತಲೆಯ ಹಂಗುಂಟೆ ಇವೆಲ್ಲವನ್ನು ಹಿಂಗಿ ಮಹಾಘನದಲ್ಲಿ ಬೆರೆದ ಶರಣಂಗೆ ನಮೋ ನಮೋ ಎಂದು ಸುಖಿಯಾದನಯ್ಯ ಅಪ್ಪಣ್ಣ ಪ್ರಿಯ ಚೆನ್ನಬಸವಣ್ಣ. Sir, once a body burns in a blaze, does it know distress? When the self comes into its own, does it rely on other human beings? When the mind is fixed on the immensity, does any illusion remain? For one who has transcended the body, is there any more to learn? Does one who has seen the light need darkness anymore? O Chenna Basavanna, dear to Appanna, I bow down in joy to the devotee who has overcome all this and dissolved into the great divine. Thank you. Is it time for one or no? No? Yeah? Okay, then this is one of Arundhathi's favorites. This is written by Sule Sankava, a profession. She's a prostitute by profession. Her work seamlessly combines the gritty reality of her work with her love of Shiva. ಒತ್ತೆಯ ಹಿಡಿದು ಮತ್ತೊತ್ತೆಯ ಹಿಡಿಯೇ ಹಿಡಿದಡೆ ಬತ್ತಲೆ ನಿಲ್ಲಿಸಿ ಕೊಲುವರಯ್ಯ ವ್ರತಹೀನನ ನರಿದು ಬೆರೆದಡೆ ಕಾದ ಕತ್ತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಕೈ ಕಿವಿ ಮೂಗ ಕೊಯ್ವರಯ್ಯ ಒಲ್ಲೆನೊಲ್ಲೆ ಬಲ್ಲೆನಾಗಿ ನಿಮ್ಮಾಣೆ ನಿರ್ಲಜ್ಜೇಶ್ವರ. She calls him Nirlajjeshwara, that is a shameless one. Oh, where have I written it? Oh, yes. Having accepted my fee from one man, I shall not accept it from another. Should I do that, they'll make me stand naked and kill me, sir. Should I knowingly mingle with someone who is not loyal and true, they'll cut off my hands, ears and nose with a red-hot sword, sir. I'm going to do no such thing, I know. I swear on you, O shameless Lord. Thank you.
Mani just suggests, I'm sorry, is this mic gone? Can you hear me? All right. It didn't seem, all right, yes. Mani just suggested moving to an audience interaction. But before that, and I do hope if there is, I'd love to have a conversation. But before that, I'm going to ask Mani to read one of her translations in the book. And Mani has two sets of translations in the book. One is a series of poems that I drew from her book, The Saundarya Lehari, which she's, of course, translated. But the other was a poet whom I requested her to translate. I'm not sure which one you'd like to read. Is it the poet that I requested you to translate? I can. Yes. So, Tarigonda Venkamamba is one hell of a woman. And before Mani reads her, I just want to say that she became one of the reasons I returned to this project on an occasion when I was ready to give it up. And I returned because Tarigonda Venkamamba is this woman who is a widow, but insists on flouting every norm associated with conventional widowhood. She wears flowers in her hair, she wears colored clothes, she wears a Mangal Sutra, she wears her vermilion. This is in the 18th century. And there's a lovely story of the elders being outraged by her independence. And they take her to the Supreme Pontiff, the Shankaracharya, and ask her to bow down before him. She refuses. And when they insist, she asks him to rise. He does. And she bows down before the empty seat. And in the wonderful moment of poetic justice, which doesn't happen too often in folklore and hagiography, particularly associated with women, in a wonderful moment, we are told that the entire seat went up in flames. That's what happens when Tarigonda Venkamamba bows. And to me, that anecdote was really one of the reasons to return and to say there is a reason to hear all these women together, to honor their singularity, but to hear them together in polyphony as well.
Thank you. So actually each section in the book has the story as part of the introduction. So not only do we get the historical information, but also the legend associated with that person, and then that's followed by the translation. When Arundhathi asked me to translate Tarigonda Venkamamba, I said, no, yeah, not really. You know, I've got this to do, and I've got that to do, and I won't be able to do this, etc. And she said, well, if you change your mind, let me know. And I never wrote back to her. A few weeks later, she emailed me again and said, Mani, hi, have you changed your mind? And you think you want to approach it now? I said, okay, well, I'll have to see what this is. And Mutyala Harati, which is the famous song that everybody knows about, which is sung in Tirupati. I had heard it, but I had never known that it was composed by Tarigonda Vengamamba. The poem that I actually enjoyed the most out of the three that I've translated here is called Chedudante Nemi, Manchidante Nemi, and that is the one I'm going to read you in English, in the translation. What's bad, what's good? So what if they call you bad or good? Why so much tossing and torment? They mistook your body for you and reproached you, yes? But who has seen the inner self that they can berate it? Why do you argue with the arrogant? Your support this master who moves in everyone. O mind, is there anyone who has seen you? Who has figured the mind's ways? Who has pondered the real, unreal? Why get all tangled in false words? Why grieve when you hear insults? Why puff up when you get praise? The Lord of the Serpent Mountain, Tarigonda's master, is witness to both wrong and right. He listens to what people profess. A mighty one, this boss, watches what's what. So be good, be truly good.
Thank you, Mani. If there are questions, if there's anything that you'd like to share, we have time for that, which is wonderful. And I'm glad that there's a possibility of this kind of informal interaction. So if there are questions, comments, if there's a poet you'd like to hear more of, yes.
It's a comment, and there's also a question associated with it, but you can choose not to answer it if you feel that it might be difficult. From what I've heard from both of you, this book is all about some of the greatest women. There's no doubt about it. Some of them are seekers, some of them are protagonists. There are male protagonists speaking about the glory of many women, fine, and there are also goddesses. And when you are talking about such great women, title of the book, Wild Woman, are you entering into controversial territory? Or is it the intention?
I think,
thank you. It's simple.
No, I'm so glad. Thank you for the question. I think the poems that we read should be indication enough that these were women who were, in fact, proudly wild women. And in actually tapping those aspects of themselves that very many women are encouraged world over to actually put a lid on. In accessing that and integrating that, these are wild women who are wise women. Absolutely. Absolutely. There are wild goddesses. Kali is in here. That's as wild as you get. But I believe that there are quieter women in here too. And, there's a beautiful line from a modern-day British poet. The line has always stayed with me. She says, "One quiet woman is much like another. Two quiet women can take on the world and his brother." They're wild. Are there poets that you'd like to hear more of? Is there anyone who'd like to share anything? We are okay with silences too, as these poets were. Maybe while you think of anything you would like to share. Oh, yes, sorry.
Good evening, ma'am. I wanted to ask you, it's just an opinion, like hypothetically, what do you think that right now it's the time, like modern poetry is written, and this is mostly bhakti poetry happened during the medieval times. So do you think there is a possibility of revival, and that too in Indian English writing? Because I think in vernacular there is undertones of that. So your opinion on that, please.
Yes, are you asking about bhakti itself, or are you asking about the oral tradition?
No, The written
and the oral. Yeah.
because there is written media.
So, can bhakti enter modern English poetry? Yes, that's a good question. In fact, the very last section of this book, which has a lot of goddess poems from, starting with the Devi Mahatmyam between the 6th and the 8th century, then there's the Saundarya Lahari, there's the Tantra, the Yogini Tantra, all of that, all right? We have all of that. But I also wanted contemporary voices, because there are, in fact, contemporary voices. So there are voices that address goddesses of various kinds. We don't have Pratibha Nandakumar here, but her Kannada poem is here. I have goddess poems in both my last two collections. And there are others. There is Kala Krishnan Ramesh, who's not here, but who's Where is she?
Kala?
Kala. Kala, would you like to read? Okay. So Kala had told me that she'd rather not. So I just want you to know that she has, in fact, several poems not here, because this is not about, the goddess poems are a different section, but she has poems to Murugan. I have a poem to Murugan too. When God is a traveler, my book of poems is addressed to Subramanya, Kartikeya, Muruga. So there is, I think in so many ways.
There is a poem to Linga Bhairavi in this anthology that's yours. You could read that maybe? Or?
Yes, I could read you. Shall I read you a one-line poem? Okay. This particular one in response to her question, this is a poem called Goddess, which is my invocation to Linga Bhairavi, who is a goddess who was consecrated 14 years ago. She is as recent and as timeless as goddesses can be. In her burning rainforest, silence is so alive, you can hear listening. In her burning rainforest, silence is so alive, you can hear listening. Thank you.
Read somewhere that Buddha had actively discouraged women from, being monks and sannyasis, because he felt that that's not what women should do. So I'd like to get your opinion on that.
He denied. He suggested that it not be done. He said no 3 times. Finally, the 3rd time he agreed. And he agreed because we are told Ananda, his most faithful, his closest disciple, pushed him. And because his own foster mother, Mahaprajapati Gautami, wanted, in fact, to be initiated. So he knew the thirst existed, but he probably felt there would be repercussions socially if he were to set up a monastic order for women. But there are indeed several women Buddhists in the Therigatha, which is an extraordinary anthology of Buddhist nuns, Purnima. Really worth reading. I have about 8 or 9 of those poems in here. Amrapali looking down at her naked body is here. Patachara talking about her quiet, undocumented moment of self-realization is here. Punnika, a slave girl, questioning a Brahmin, a ritualistic Brahmin, and asking him, do you really think bathing in a holy river is going to wash away your karma? She is empowered by the Buddha's teaching of self-determination, but you realize the empowerment goes so deep. We are not just talking about women who are reformed or uplifted. We are talking about women who are transformed. And there are so many voices of that kind in the Therigatha. And they're personal, they're candid, they're intimate. So when you read the Therigatha today, it is like reading women of our times. Just utterly remarkable voices.
Hello, good evening. I'm just reading a line from the introduction, which is my favorite. A poem can offer us respite from too much meaning. So I'd love for you to say a little more about that.
It's true, isn't it? What is your name?
Charumati.
Charumati.
The context I'd like to say is I attended a poetry workshop. It was a one-day thing. You had come to Dampukt at Adi Shakti. So I remember that day. It was very special. And I reconnected with writing poetry on that day, because before that I had been writing poetry in college, and my English lecturer had gently nudged me towards writing prose. So, so after that I stopped, and then I reconnected only much later. But what I really found when I reconnected with writing poetry is that following the image, like you said, not searching for anything, but simply following the image. I found that very interesting. So when I read this line, I don't know, it just leapt out at me. So I would love to hear from you.
I'm particularly glad you chose that line, Charumati, because in a sense, it's interesting, isn't it, that I chose to read that particular Rupa Bhavani poem, where she says, the one who listens is resplendent within me. And it struck me now as I responded to her by reading my own Linga Bhairavi poem, that in the presence of the sacred, one can hear listening. I feel that the finest sacred poetry always invites us to this domain where we are, in fact, we encounter silence of some kind. We encounter silence. And to my mind, the finest poetry invites us to that place too. And how do you craft an utterance so that the word or the sound becomes so invitational that you are drawn without knowing why? You know, we've all experienced people, a few people we've met, or just a few situations we've been in, where we knew we wanted to be there, but we didn't know why. And certainly, I knew this, Charumati, as a student of poetry. I knew what it was like to be asked, what is the poet trying to say? And never knowing the answer to that one. But I always knew when I was in the presence of poetry. And I recognized it before I understood it. And I think that's what poetry does to us. And that is why it is a reprieve from too much meaning, because we live in a world choked with meaning. Truly choked. And I think we need, we talk of information overload casually, but we are downloading every moment. We all know this. We're all on our cell phones, being bombarded all the time. Our conversations with each other seem to be devoid of pauses. So in a very deep way, I believe poetry is the only verbal art there is that truly embraces the pause. And by embracing the pause, it invites you to those places. And it tells you that simply creating meaning all the time is not the only way in which to lead a life of joy or of fulfillment. So I think when we ask each other questions like, what is the poet trying to say? We forget that the poet is never trying to say anything. The poet is saying it. And she is also packing with it a certain energetic silence. The best poets do that. Can I read you Janabai's mother-in-law poem, please? The reason I have to is because, what I loved about Akka Mahadevi, Lal Ded, all of them, is when you're being invited into the kitchen, which is frequently, metaphors from the kitchen are very strong amongst many of the women poets, you realize this kitchen is a very dangerous place to be. So Akka Mahadevi, for instance, says, take these husbands who die, decay, and feed them to your kitchen fires. Give me the imperishable one. And in the same way, Lal Ded says, the 14th century Kashmiri woman mystic, she says, I pestled my heart in the mortar of love, roasted it, and ate it up. This is a terrifying kitchen. This is not mum's cozy kitchen. This is a laboratory in which the woman herself has turned into this powerful alchemist, in which she herself is the subject of her own experiment. So it's this danger that I wanted to smell again. And it's in the light of that danger that I'd invite you to listen to the mother-in-law poem. Okay? So here's Janabai again, translated by Arun Kolatkar. God, my darling, do me a favor and kill my mother-in-law. I will feel lonely when she is gone. But you will be a good God, won't you? And kill my father-in-law. I will be glad when he is gone. But you will be a good God, won't you? And kill my sister-in-law. I will be free when she is gone. I will pick up my begging bowl and be on my way. Let them drop dead, says Jenny. Then we will be left alone. Just you and I. Let me also say, for all the women here who walk out as mendicants and bang the door behind them like Nora in Ibsen's Doll's House, many of these women, of course, all of them centuries before Nora, but for all those women who did that, there were many women in very, very happy relationships. And one of my favorites, Purnima, because you mentioned the Buddhist nuns, is Bhadda Kapilani. Bhadda Kapilani is a Buddhist nun whom we are told had a spiritual inclination from an early age, but was married, like many girls are. She married a man who had a similar spiritual inclination. So she lived a very happy married life with Kashyapa until both of them decided at one point, we've had a happy time. Now it's time to address what really counts, the deeper questions. One took the road left, the other took the road right, and they parted ways, and then they met with the same guru, the Buddha. But to me, this is such a wonderful template of a partnership of equality. It is not someone leaving his wife and walking out. And of course, those stories exist, and there are women who walk out and want to kill their mothers-in-law. That exists too. But this is a beautiful, harmonious story of two people arriving at a decision consensually. And this is, again, 2,500 years ago. Wonderful stories, really, isn't it? Yeah.
There's a very interesting poem by Pratibha, actually, who is not here, where she talks about how the goddess who is angry is pacified by the call of the child, you know, the suckling, and how the suckling removes her anger. The integration into normalcy, into loving relationships, and how that is actually a part of the divine life. It's not a contradiction. That poem does that beautifully.
It's a beautiful poem, and she will be there reading at Atagalata on Saturday, for those of you who'd like to come. But because this book just opened at this page, I want to read a poem that in fact takes off from what you said, which is the fact that the wild aspects of these women, which many of them are able to give voice to in their poetry, is also what struck me years ago when I read this book called The Mad Woman in the Attic. And I think many of us who read it, and I noticed some of you nodding your head, I think many of us who read it recognized something then. We recognized the part of ourselves that it is just safest to keep locked up. And you gradually realize, and I think the life journey helps men and women to realize this, all of us to realize this, that in some way, by tapping into those attic reserves, something begins to grow more complete. Something begins to grow more integrated within the self. So that is really, to my mind, what poems like Pratibha's also allude to. The nurturant mother and the ferocious mother are the same. And here we have the 18th and 19th century Bengali poet, Kamalakanta Bhattacharya. And I love these Bengali poets because starting with Ram Prasad Sen, the way they speak to Kali, yes, there is this terrifying figure, but she's also the mother. She's also the one whom you can confide in. She's also the one whom you can, And this brings me to a literary form that I love, the Ninda Stuti, which is the license to throw a tantrum in a poem and call it a prayer. It is a unique inheritance of the subcontinent. I'm in love with it. And here's Kamalakanta Bhattacharya doing just that when he tells his Kali, yes, you know, I love you and all that, but could you not just have dressed a little more appropriately? Can you not just put on some clothes, is really what he's saying. But it's a lovely poem translated by Rachel Fell McDermott. Who is this? Dressed like a crazy woman, robed with sky. Whom does she belong to? She's let down her hair, thrown off her clothes, strung human hands around her waist, and taken a sword in her hand. Her face sparkles from the reflection of her teeth, and her tongue lolls out. That smile on her moon face drips, heaps and heaps of nectar. Mother, are you going to rescue Kamalakanta in this outfit?
I'd like to add something to this whole point about wildness, wilderness as well. You know, no matter what figure you look at, let's say you look at Tripura Sundari, you know, so beautifully dressed, there is jewelry, there is this smile on the face, it is a very sanitized version. But then you go and read Saundarya Lahari, and you understand the meaning, and you realize that this is nothing benign here. There is nothing benign here. So all the people who feel very comfortable that, oh, all my sister, my mother, my wife, my spouse, my friends, they're all doing Saundarya Lahari, all wonderful people, they will come back very benign, are so mistaken if you actually read the meaning of it. And the same with Devi Mahatmyam. Whatever legend you're reading about the feminine, divine is really powerful. And it is wild, actually. And not wild in a way that contradicts the world. It absolutely integrates the world. And yet it is beyond that. So in the seeker's voice, not only you have the yearning and the prayer, but when you have that moment of encounter, the description of those moments, they have to be wild. There is no other option.
The book. Yes? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mani. Thank you.
On behalf of BIC, I'd like to thank Arundhathi and Mani and also Vanamala and Ahalya for sharing their poems with us. The books are available for sale outside, and Arundhathi will also sign the book outside. So thank you everyone for being here this evening.